Hi, that was a great intro. Yeah, so I'm Renee. I'm part of the founding team at Haven. We're a company in San Francisco, Singapore, and Switzerland. We're a tech company that's transforming global trade. And we're doing that by building an automated platform for freight procurement. And I can tell you honestly that if you say that to somebody at a bar, their eyes will glaze over so fast, and you are the single most boring person in the room. But I'm going to talk about transforming old industries because freight and shipping is one of the oldest industries. And it is largely lagged behind in technological adoption. So I'm going to talk about how the founders of Haven kind of took varied backgrounds and approached this problem in what I think is kind of an interesting new way. Let's make this. No, didn't work. There we go. Too many, sorry. They told me the clicker was tricky, and it is. OK, so in the 1960s, Malcolm McLean came up with the idea for the box, which is just the corrugated metal box. You know, you see them out here on the port of Montreal. And it fundamentally changed not just shipping, but actually the world. Containerization is probably, I think, a top 20 innovation of all time. 90% of everything moves on a container ship. So the chair you're sitting on, the clothes you're wearing, what you eat. This industry is the circulatory system of the world economy. It's how everything gets to where it needs to go, and it's what keeps the world moving. And the way it works is, the great innovation is this idea of standardization reducing risk. So if you put everything in a box, box goes onto the ship. Ship, when it reaches the port, is unloaded by a crane rather than people because it's a standardized size. So you can build in automation to move the box from the ship to the chassis. And then it goes on a truck or a rail, or it sits at the dock for a while. But this saves time and money, and it reduces risk. And the box actually is directly attributed to a 700% increase in world trade between 1960 and the early 1990s. So this is phenomenal. This is way more than any single trade deal or political kind of attempt to modernize trade has achieved. This is the great innovation in world trade. So over $15 trillion in value is moved on the ocean each year. US is about $4 trillion. And when we talk about the number of these boxes that move, it's actually in the hundreds of millions of boxes shipped each year in port traffic. So this is an absolutely massive industry. But despite its massive reach and importance, the industry has really lagged in IT adoption. It's very much kind of behind in terms of tech. So it's a world of middlemen, of spreadsheets, of telephone calls. This is kind of an example of, you can either go carrier direct or through a forwarder to book freight onto one of those vessels. And I'll just walk through that to give you a sense of how the industry operates today. If you are a very large shipper moving hundreds of thousands to millions of these boxes a year, the way that you achieve your freight booking is you email, or you fax, or you call, and you send a spreadsheet to the carrier. So our guy in yellow is the shipper, you've got the carrier companies, and this is called a tender process. You give them a spreadsheet showing your port pairs and then how many boxes you think you're going to move at any given time. Some percentage of the carrier companies, not all, will get back to you. If you're Walmart or Target, maybe everyone will get back to you. But for most people, that's not going to happen. And then what happens is they come back, and your spreadsheet is now a matrix, and you have this kind of matrix of quotes. But they're not standardized because there's different fees and different surcharges that are levied depending on the port, depending on the currency, depending on the price of oil at the time. And what you're trying to do is they're trying to lock in rates for a period of 6 months to a year. And the reason they have to do that is because even though in periods of price volatility, one or the other party to that contract is going to lose, capacity management is so critical to keeping the flow of goods moving that even though this is a terrible, arcane system, this is the best that they have, and so this is the way that they do it. Because the carrier companies need to understand demand forecasting, and they need to know how many slots on their ship they can basically pre-sell in order to know that they can keep the ships moving profitably. And the Walmarts and Targets of the world need to know that they can get their goods on the shelf in time for back to school, in time for Black Friday, and then just more generally. So this is kind of, it's a lousy system, but trade is important, and so therefore this is how these systems operate. And then if you're a small company, like how many of you guys in here have a hardware startup? Not many hardware people here. OK, there we go, one in the back. So if you're a hardware shipper, this is actually even worse, because if you've tried to get goods here, really the carrier companies won't deal with you if you're moving under 50 boxes a year. And that's because they have account executives. So they have humans who take people out to dinner, and it's very much an old kind of outbound sales process. And that you're not worth their time if you're moving not very much. So then you have this world of basically brokers and middlemen. And what the brokers and middlemen are doing, those are the guys in the green, is they're literally sitting there just forming this intermediate layer between the shipper and the carrier. And what they do is they tack on margin at the end in exchange for their services. So if you're a small shipper and you reach out to maybe 3 forwarders and they in turn reach out to maybe 3 carriers each, the forwarder is never incentivized to tell you what he is paying for the freight, so you only hear this kind of all-in number at the end. And as brokers do, they make all of their money on a markup, so they're actually incentivized to keep the industry opaque, to minimize price transparency, and to keep you calling and emailing and making phone calls. And that is, basically, it's a broken process full of middlemen. And it may be surprising that a massive industry still operates under these terms, but until recently, they just simply haven't had to modernize. Now I'm having clicker problems again. There we go. OK. So before Haven, I was actually a VC. Last time I was here, I was actually a VC. So I've been on both sides of the table now. And as an investor, I think that when you look at founders who are tackling old industries, there are really 2 kind of key criteria in thinking about how how things might turn out. And the first is time. And I know that the theme of the festival is firsts, but I'm actually going to stand up here and advocate for not necessarily being first. You want to have a first innovative idea, but what really matters is getting your timing right. Because if you're going into an old industry rather than creating a market, what really matters is kind of picking the time when your innovation is likely to be adopted by the market. Otherwise, what you're going to hear is, no, we've always done it this way, and it works just fine. Yeah. So there are certain, there's this B school term. I never went to B school, but it's a thing, and it's called dematurity. It is a series of very small innovations that outliers in a big industry start to do. And that's because they need to differentiate somehow. They're not the main players in the industry. They're kind of these sub-players. So they're more likely to be innovative. They're the early adopters, even in an old industry. And so what they do is they make a series of these changes, and they change the way that they do business. And this leads to this kind of crescendo, whereby the rest of the players in the industry realize that there's this newer way of doing business, and then everybody kind of cascades, and there's this new trend towards adoption. So the idea is you want to find an industry that was mature when it begins to undergo this period of dematurity. And so there's a couple of hallmarks that indicate that that might be happening. And the first is that people in the industry are changing. New technology is changing the core product. There's some new actual tech that suddenly made it possible to do things that couldn't have been done before. Damn clicker. New regulations are reshaping what's possible. For better or worse, something in the regulatory environment has changed. And then there are new distribution systems that get the product to people. I'm just going to hold my hand here. There. So, and the internet has been actually a phenomenal new distribution system, right? If you think about it, the internet was the kind of precipitator of dematurity in a number of industries, dozens of them that had been mature. And then all of a sudden we started rethinking, to use the internet to get your groceries, to watch your movies, to do all of these things that had never been done before. It's kind of like this brand new channel. So in shipping logistics, we see people in the industry changing, right? They're our age now. They are digital natives. They get their taxis on Uber. They get their groceries on Instacart. And then they go into work, and all of a sudden they're doing phones and faxes and emails to book their freight, which seems really kind of incongruous to them. They believe there's a better way, and they're looking for it now. And then the other kind of interesting major thing that is really unique to the shipping industry is over the last 50 years, we've seen container ships grow from 1,500 boxes when Malcolm McLean started containerization to 20,000 TEU vessels. So these massive behemoths that have economies of scale that do to some extent serve the needs of the carrier companies. But there's something really interesting here, which is that when you have a phenomenally large ship, you need more boxes to fill it. And it takes 2 years from the time that Maersk or someone orders a vessel to the time it hits the water. And so demand is largely forecasted as a function of trade, of global GDP. So if you hit a period like in 2008, when there's a very unpredictable global recession and there's a massive trade slowdown, what happens is the ships that were ordered are going to hit the water even during the period of demand drop. So you have this increase in supply that's not matched by an increase in demand, and all of a sudden you see the balance of power shift from the carrier company to the person who needs the freight. And so that's another indication that when you see this kind of power shift happen in the buyer versus the seller, that's a really great indication that this is an old industry that fundamentally needs to change. So, I'm so bad at this. There we go. Okay, so global logistics, no longer a human scale problem. So much capacity, so many companies, so many shippers, including this very long tail of small shippers looking to bypass the freight forwarder market and get carrier direct. So this is how we see the issue at Haven. There are some industries that suddenly are no longer human scale, and that means the time is right to really start thinking about them from the perspective of disruption. So right time, and then the next factor is right team. A lot of aspiring founders think that they have to have deep domain knowledge before entering a space. I had, you heard my weird background, right? I was a derivatives trader actually for 7 years before becoming a VC, before starting Haven. And as I'll go into in a little bit, really my time as a trader was the most relevant to logistics. Our CEO, same thing, a trader, ad tech. Our COO, supply chain at Apple and Nest. So none of us were deep, none of us came out of Maersk. And so I'm going to argue for, right now, kind of the value of an outsider perspective. And to use, Tim's example, Uber, right? Travis Kalanick, his prior company, he didn't work in the taxi industry. He didn't innovate on taxis. And so when he decided he wanted to rethink how people move around cities or how people hail cabs, he didn't build software to incrementally improve the taxi industry. He had a background in peer-to-peer file sharing. That was his prior company, right? And he built what is effectively a peer-to-peer network for rides. And so it's taking this complete, fundamentally different way of looking at something and saying, we can rethink an old industry by getting so far outside of the bounds of what's normal. And that's where your big first comes in, right? It's not necessarily timing. Haven wasn't the first person to think, hey, we should automate freight procurement. But we did think about it in a fundamentally different way than I think most people who would have come out of logistics would have. And that's because, like I said, 2 of us came out of quant finance. And technology transformed finance over a fairly long period of time, but really it was sort of very, very slow until it was very, very fast. And so, trade, if you think about it, global trade started in the 1300s, merchants of Venice. If you wanted to buy state debt, slate carriers literally walked around. It was written on a board. And if you wanted to transact, you found that man, and that was who you dealt with. And then the 1600s bring this kind of introduction of equity, right? And that is actually pioneered by the shipping industry. The Dutch East Indies Company was the first company to offer equity. And eventually you have this trade begins to develop, and you have this notion of a standardized, structuralized exchange where everybody is. And so yes, you still have the brokers, but there's a standing order book. There's buyers and sellers. There's price transparency. There's centralized clearing. There's a series of innovations that come through that basically turn it from this ad hoc kind of peer-to-peer, well, hey, I want to buy something, well, I know this guy, and the I know a guy is the number one phrase that you actually hear in freight. Well, I've had my guy, he's been good to me for a long time. So this is kind of where the shipping industry is now. And then all of a sudden we see what technology does, right? We see technology come in. All of a sudden the markets are automated. You don't call a broker to find out where a share of stock is trading. You just pick up your phone and look at an app. But if you wanted to find out the price of a container from Hong Kong to Long Beach, you would have to actually still get on the phone and call somebody. So what we do is we say, one industry inspires another. We saw this transformation. I was a trader when automated trading kind of really became a thing, when it went from almost entirely computers, high-frequency trading. So we were inspired to do the same thing here. So we use data and algorithms to match buyers and sellers of freight the same way you see in financial markets. We run what are effectively real-time auctions. We eliminate emails. We eliminate phone calls. We basically say we can rethink this industry the same way that finance transformed using technology. And the interesting challenge, the kind of corollary to being an outsider, is that sometimes the real risk of transforming an old industry with an outside perspective is that you just don't know what you're talking about. And so the number one way to bypass that is to do so much customer research and so many customer calls, because I think that there's this trend towards talking about disruption in tech. All right, and even though that's what the title of this talk is, at Haven we actually don't really talk about disruption, we talk about enablement. We talk about transforming an old industry by enabling people in the industry to operate more effectively. And that's because, the narrative of the swashbuckling young gun coming in and telling people who've been in an industry for 50 years, like, no, you just need my app, right? That's a surefire way to have nobody take you seriously. So instead, we talk about how technology can provide a lower cost of customer acquisition, how technology can enable the people who work in the industry to think about things in a new way. And that's, I think, the key to transforming an old industry, is to really be respectful of how things have been done and really present everything in terms of how you are actually improving things for them, as opposed to saying, like, no, you guys are all wrong. You've been doing it all wrong for 60 years. So I think, why does this matter? Tim briefly touched on this as well. And transforming big old industries can really change the world, right? They're big and old because they matter. They're big and old because they serve a lot of people. They do something valuable. And as I said, in the case of freight, they literally transport the materials that people need to build their houses. It's transporting their food. This is an industry that fundamentally touches everybody. So by pushing our industry towards a promising future, what we're trying to say is that efficient, ethical ways of doing business can still be the most profitable. And so, if we're hiring, if we actually have a couple Canadians, so and thank you for listening. Okay.